Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Undergraduate Philosophy Club's first event of the spring semester on moral facts. I would like to thank you all on behalf of the club for joining our event tonight. If you enjoy the event and would like to come to one of our meetings, we are holding our first meeting on Wednesday, February 3rd at 3 p.m. It will be a virtual meeting and the link will be posted on the Sun Devil Sync page. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I am the president, or you could email Tim. He has been helping out as well. So if you have any questions about the meeting, just let us know. During tonight's event, we will be just discussing moral facts. We're so fortunate to have Dr. Portmore, Dr. Marneffe, and Dr. Nair with us today to share their expertise on the topic. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and the professors will answer them at the end of the event. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Portmore to begin his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Isabella, and thanks for organizing this, and thanks to all of you for attending. So I'm not going to be talking about whether there are moral facts. And first let me say, what I'm interested in is whether there are moral facts, like a fact that murder is wrong, in the same way that there's a fact that the earth is spherical. So I'm interested in whether there's a fact about whether murder is wrong, and also whether that fact is independent of our beliefs and our social conventions. So for instance, I think there's a fact about what is rude, what is rude and what's not rude, but that is not independent of our social conventions. What's rude just depends upon our social conventions. So I'm going to use the term objective moral facts, although really that's misleading. It's not like there are some facts are objective and some facts are not. What I mean by an objective moral fact is a moral fact that's independent of what our beliefs are and what our social conventions are. And as I said, I'm not actually going to argue whether there are objective moral facts or not. I'm just going to debunk what I take to be the most popular argument that people give for there not being any objective moral facts. And that's the argument from disagreement. So I take it that many people observe that the kind of disagreement there is about moral matters is much more significant, both qualitatively and quantitatively, than the sort of disagreement that there is in both the sciences and in math. So when it comes to science and mathematics, the experts tend to converge upon answers to at least a good base of questions. I mean, scientists may not agree on everything. They may not agree on string theory or whether there's, a unified force theory or something like that. But they all accept the theory of gravity, the theory of evolution, and so forth, and all mathematicians accept the Pythagorean theorem. So there may be some disagreement here and there, but there is quite a bit of convergence on some core areas. But that's not the case in philosophy. For instance, I consider myself a consequentialist, where Professor de Marneffe is a contractualist, and we've tried to convince each other of the error of the other's ways many times, but to no avail. And what's more is it seems like there's no way to resolve the disagreement. Our disagreement is very fundamental. I think where Professor de Marneffe thinks that morality is about what we owe to each other, I think it's about instead, or in addition to, about making the world a better place. And so we don't accept the same assumptions. And then I have colleagues that, do philosophy in a different way than I do. I tend to do it from the armchair. My colleague, Professor Panios, he does experimental philosophy. So we don't even necessarily share the same methods. So many people think, well, what best explains the fact that there's so much moral disagreement as compared to disagreement about scientific matters and mathematical matters? And I think what they think is the best explanation is that there's just no objective fact about what's right and wrong. That's why people don't agree whether abortion's right or wrong or capital punishment's right or wrong. So they think the best explanation is the lack of moral facts. Just as we might think, what's the best explanation for why people can't agree? I hope you've seen the latest memes with Bernie Sanders in his mittens at the inauguration, whether his mittens were cool or fashionable. Why is there so much disagreement? Why can't even the experts, the fashionistas, agree on whether his mittens were fashionable? Well, because there isn't no fact of the matter. There is at least no belief independent or social convention independent fact about whether or not those types of mittens are cool or appropriate to wear at something like a presidential inauguration. And so likewise, people think, well, just as there doesn't seem to be any sort of agreement about that, there doesn't seem to be any agreement about moral matters, even amongst the experts. So what must best explain that this moral disagreement is that there are no moral facts. Okay. Now, the reason why they think that's the best explanation, that the best explanation for moral disagreement is there are no moral facts, is because the alternative seems highly implausible. So what else might explain disagreement? Well, another source of disagreement is ignorance or irrationality or distortions of the truth. So for instance, why is there so much disagreement about certain like conspiracy theories, like whether there's a cabal of Democrats who are satanic worshipers and pedophiles who are running the deep state? Well, I think that's because some people are just ignorant of what the facts are. And why is there disagreement amongst certain cultures and certain flat earthers and scientists? It's because I think that the flat earthers are ignorant of the truth. But that's not a plausible explanation for why, for instance, Professor Marneffe and myself disagree about what the correct moral theory is. We're both well-educated, have PhDs in moral philosophy, have published in moral philosophy, have read all the same stuff. Marneffe has read my book and still doesn't believe consequentialism. So it's not, and he's not an irrational or ignorant or unintelligent person, and neither am I. So that can't be the explanation. So the explanation must be that there's no moral facts. Now, I would agree with this if those were the only two possible explanations. If the only two possible explanations were either there are moral facts and it's just that once the reason why there's disagreement is because there's ignorance of those facts, or the explanation is there's just no moral facts and so there's nothing for people to agree on, then I would agree that probably the best explanation would be that there's no moral facts. But there is a third possible explanation, which I think is the correct explanation. And that has to do with the nature of philosophical inquiry. So I'm going to take a little short tangent about the nature of philosophy and philosophical inquiry. Philosophy is unique as a discipline in that you do not have to accept any disciplinary assumptions or methods in order to count as doing philosophy. You can do philosophy so long as you are investigating certain questions, like whether we have free will, whether there are moral facts. And you don't have to accept like Rene Descartes' method of doubt or foundationalism or coherentism or X-Fi or any other particular methodology to count as doing philosophy. You also don't have to accept any kind of particular assumptions, like you don't have to accept classical logic or the law of non-contradiction or the principle of bivalence to count as being a philosopher. Now that's different from other disciplines, right? You don't count as doing science if you don't employ the scientific method. You don't count as doing science if you don't accept or assume that there's a world that exists independently of our perceiving it, a world that we can learn about via our empirical observations. And that's why, we say we don't teach creationism in science class, and we don't look at the argument from design in science class, because to count as science, you have to do empirical investigation. And creationism doesn't involve doing that kind of empirical work. And the argument from design for the existence of God doesn't do that kind of empirical work. So it just doesn't count as science. Same thing with mathematics. If you don't accept Euclid's axioms and you don't accept classical logic as the method of inferring certain theorems and postulates from those axioms using classical logic, then you just don't count as doing geometry. Okay. So philosophy is unique in that in order to count as doing philosophy, you don't have to accept any particular assumptions or even any particular methodology. And this is why philosophers don't converge on views in the way that scientists and mathematicians do. And this is why, with respect to philosophical disagreement, you don't have sort of a resolution of these philosophical questions in the way that you have a resolution in mathematics and in science. So that leads us to the third possible explanation. Why is there so much moral disagreement? Because we do moral inquiry via philosophical inquiry. And when we do philosophical inquiry, we're not required to start from any certain assumptions, and we're not required to follow any particular methodology. So Peter and Marneffe can count as doing moral philosophy, even though he doesn't start from the same assumption to me that I do, that morality has to be about bringing about a better world. And Angel Pinillos, Professor Pinillos, doesn't have to believe in my methodology and believe that the only way we can make progress in moral philosophy is through thinking about it from the armchair, whereas he might think that we have to do some experimental philosophy. Okay, so we've had three explanations. One is the reason for moral disagreement. One explanation is the disagreement is due to the fact that there are no moral facts for us to agree on. The second explanation is that although there are moral facts for us to agree upon, we fail to agree because some people are just ignorant of those facts. And then the third explanation is that the reason why there's so much moral disagreement is because moral disagreement is done as in the mode of philosophical inquiry, and the nature of philosophical inquiry is such that it doesn't result in convergence on certain particular views. I think the third is the best explanation. And to see that, notice that we don't find that there's any greater disagreement about moral issues among philosophers than there are about other philosophical questions among philosophers. So we find that the kind of moral disagreement that the kind of disagreement we have with respect to morality is the same as the kind of disagreement we have with respect to whether there's free will, with respect to whether science can make progress, with respect to whether how to solve the mind-body problem, and so on and so forth. So it's no surprise then that we find that there's so much moral disagreement and that even the experts don't converge on certain truths. And that's because just the nature of philosophical inquiry. Now, if we wanted to approach morality in a different way, if we wanted to approach it from a Catholic perspective, in which we just assume that church doctrine is authoritative with respect to what's right and wrong, then we wouldn't have nearly as much disagreement. In that case, we would just note that Pope John Paul has written an encyclical about the sanctity of human life, and he's stated that according to church doctrine, killing a fetus intentionally or as a means is certainly morally wrong. And if we assume that church doctrine is authoritative, then we should all converge, just as all Catholic bishops, I take it, have converged on the view that abortion is wrong. So, but if we instead approach it as we do, as a philosophical matter, and allow people to question various assumptions and various methods, then it's no surprise that we have the kind of disagreement that we have, and that's no reason to think there are no moral facts. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Portmore. If you have any questions or comments for him, you could drop them in the Q&A feature. Now we are going to move on to Dr. Marneffe.
Thank you, Professor Portmore, for a very interesting and enjoyable talk. I'm going to read my remarks because it's easy for me to do it that way. So, and it will take about the same amount of time. And I'm going to approach the question of moral facts from a different angle. So here are two different questions. What makes moral facts facts, and what makes some facts moral facts? I'm going to talk about the second question. I'll assume that there are normative facts, that is, facts about what we ought to believe and do and desire and feel. More specifically, I'll assume that there are facts about what there is decisive reason to do. On some occasions, there's decisive reason to do something or decisive reason not to do it. My question is this: of all the facts there are about what there is decisive reason to do, which of these facts are moral facts? Not all facts about what there is decisive reason to do seem like moral facts. There's decisive reason for me not to turn on the burner of my electric stove, wait till it's red hot, and then place my hand on it. But this kind of fact is typically characterized as a prudential fact, a fact about what it is prudent to do, and not as a moral fact or a fact about what it is morally right to do. You might put the thought this way: if I put my hand on a hot stove, I'm doing something stupid, but not immoral. In addition to facts about decisive prudential reasons, let's see, how do I navigate this? Oh yeah, over here, sorry. In addition to facts about decisive prudential reasons, there might be other kinds of fact about what there's decisive reason to do that are not moral facts, such as aesthetic facts. For example, there might be decisive reason not to finish a song with a particular chord. This chord might be ugly or make no musical sense, or this way of ending the song might be hackneyed or cliched. But if one of these is the decisive reason, we might still ask, is it a moral fact that you shouldn't finish the song this way, or is it rather an aesthetic fact? My question then is to repeat, what makes some facts about what there's decisive reason to do moral facts? Here's one proposal. Moral facts are facts about what we're obligated to do. Some of our actions are obligatory and other actions are not. Moral facts, one might say, are facts about which actions are obligatory and which are not. If there's decisive reason to do something because it is obligatory, then this fact about decisive reasons is a moral fact too. So to answer my question, of all those normative facts there are about what there is decisive reason to do, the subset of moral facts includes all and only those of which the following is true. There is decisive reason to do the action or not to do it because this is obligatory. On its own, this does seem to be missing something. Moral facts also seem to include facts about when it is fitting or appropriate to have certain negative emotions, to resent someone for violating one's rights, for example, or to feel guilty for doing so. But we might try to fix this up by making the following assumption. These negative emotions are appropriate if and only if someone has violated an obligation. Making this assumption, we can then say that moral facts are facts about what actions are obligatory, and so about when it is appropriate to have these negative emotions. I'll now refer to this view that I've been discussing as the minimalist view of moral facts. Is it right? Some of you might doubt it because it implies that many facts that you see as moral facts are not moral facts. Here are some. That a non-obligatory action is good to do. That a non-obligatory action is praiseworthy. That a non-obligatory action is kind, generous, humane. That it is good to be the kind of person who does generous, kind, humane, non-obligatory actions. That a non-obligatory action is one that a good friend, good parent, good child, good citizen would do. That an action that violates no obligation mistreats something precious or sacred or otherwise worthy of respect. Someone committed to the minimalist view might accept that none of these is in fact a moral fact. So if you accept the minimalist view, then you have the beginning of an answer to my question about which normative facts are moral facts. But some of you probably think that some of the facts on my list are moral facts. And if this is correct, then we're back to the original question, which is, what is it that makes them moral facts? Here's one thought that is likely to occur to some of you. Moral facts are just facts about right and wrong. But which facts are these? Are they just facts about our obligations and the negative emotions that are warranted by failures to meet these obligations? If so, then this proposal is equivalent to the minimalist view that some of you might think is too narrow. On the other hand, if facts about right and wrong include other facts as well, which facts do they include and why? Another thought is that moral facts are just evaluative facts. Any evaluative fact is a moral fact. That pleasure is good and pain is bad are moral facts. That Beethoven's Ninth is a great symphony is a moral fact. That Tesla stock was a good investment in 2020 is a moral fact. But this will probably strike some of you as too inclusive. The goodness of Beethoven's Ninth seems like an aesthetic fact, not a moral fact. Facts about whether stock is a good investment seem like financial facts or prudential facts, not moral facts. Some might even resist the idea that it's a moral fact that pleasure is good and pain is bad. Moral facts, one might think, have something to do with right and wrong actions, and pleasure would be good and pain would be bad, even if no actions were right or wrong. Another thought is that moral facts are just evaluative facts about what actions we should take. Any true statement of the form S should do X or S should not do X are moral facts. But this will also probably strike some of you as too inclusive. Suppose you shouldn't play a chord at the end of the song. Is that a moral fact? If you should have bought Tesla stock last year, is that a moral fact? If you shouldn't put your hand on a hot stove, is that a moral fact? Here's another thought. Moral facts are facts about a certain class of reasons, moral reasons. The fact that a reason is a moral fact, and any normative fact that is made true by a moral reason is a moral fact. For example, if there's a moral reason that makes resentment appropriate, the fact that resentment is appropriate is a moral fact. If there's a moral reason that makes it the case that one should not assault someone, then the fact that one should not assault someone is a moral fact. But now, of course, I'm going to ask, which reasons are moral reasons? What property is it that all and only moral reasons share that identifies them as a distinctive kind of reason? Suppose we answer that moral reasons are just those relevant to determining what obligations we have. This leads us back to the minimalist position that is incompatible with what some of you might believe are moral facts. Consider, for example, the fact that a non-obligatory action is good to do, which some of you might see as a moral fact. On the view of moral facts we're now considering, this is a moral fact only if it is made true by a moral reason. And on the present proposal, moral reasons are only those that are relevant to determining what obligations we have. But how is the fact that a non-obligatory action is good relevant to determining what obligations we have? And if it's not relevant, then the fact non-obligatory action is good is not a moral fact after all. So the question I've asked here is, which normative facts are moral facts? I've given some possible answers, but all of them seem unsatisfactory in one way or another. As a result, I'm tempted to accept a debunking view that the notion of a moral fact fails to pick out a coherent or useful category of normative fact. There are many different kinds of normative fact, facts about what to believe, do, desire, and feel. And within each of these categories, there are many different kinds of fact too. For example, there are different kinds of fact about what you ought to do. Some of these are facts, some of these are facts, some of these facts are about what is obligatory to do, some are facts about what it is prudent to do, and some are facts about what would make you a good or praiseworthy person. But I'm tempted to think there is no unifying property that all the normative facts that people are inclined to call moral have in common that explains why all and only these normative facts should be counted as moral facts. People use the word moral in different ways, and there's nothing that makes one way of using the word correct and all of the others incorrect. Because it's not clear what the term moral means in phrases like moral facts, moral beliefs, moral values, moral agency, and so on. I think we should make an effort not to use the term moral in our philosophical writing and discussion unless we explain explicitly what we mean by it. Because people mean different things by the term moral, using it in philosophical writing and discussion without explanation leads to unclarity, confusion, and a failure to communicate. So if we aim at clarity in our own thinking and in our communication with others, we should try to avoid this term when we can, unless we make what we mean by it crystal clear. That's enough from me.
Thank you, Professor. We will now be hearing from Dr. Nair.
All right, hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, hopefully you guys can see this. So I'm going to talk about how to think about this question of moral facts, or rather sort of two suggestions to help constrain our thinking about this issue a little bit more, because just sort of bluntly stated, it's hard to know what to say when you're asked about what a moral fact is or if there are moral facts. So my plan is I'm going to talk about the two suggestions. This is an outline of it. So suggestion number one, don't worry too much about what facts are. And to get you in the mood to take this suggestion seriously, I'm going to start off with a sort of strong, big theory according to which this is true. And then I'm going to back off and say something more modest that sort of is inspired by the theory, but doesn't require you to accept the theory. So the big theory that I want to tell you about is a theory known as deflationism. So deflationism is a theory that people use about many different notions in philosophy, probably most famously about the notion of truth. And the basic idea of deflationism about facts says, look, when you're thinking about facts, all there is really to know or say about facts is given by that claim in the box. And the claim is, it's a fact that P, if and only if P. So what does this mean? This means the question of, is it a fact that murder is wrong? That just reduces to the claim, is murder wrong? Or is it a fact that Columbus was colonized the Americas? That question just reduces to the question of, did Columbus colonize the Americas? The only role of talk of facts, according to this theory, is as a useful summarizing device. So for example, if I want to talk about everything that occurs in biology, I might say the biological facts suggest. And why is that useful? It's useful because I don't have to now list every single one of those biological facts. I can just gesture at them by using this term, the biological facts. So that's what deflationism about facts says. It says all fact talk does is a useful way of summarizing a big list of things you can mention without using the word fact at all. Talk of facts is basically, empty in a certain sense. It's really just reducible to the talk of the thing you say after you say it is a fact. Okay. And so how does this apply to moral facts and questions about moral facts? I already hinted at this, but the basic idea is what you should do is translate your concerns about moral facts into concerns about, for example, whether it's wrong to gratuitously harm someone, or whatever your favorite moral fact is. So whatever you're worried about when you are concerned about whether there are moral facts, just turn it into a question of whether a particular thing is wrong. That's all you should do. So that's a grand theory. It's a theory that purports to give us an answer to the question of what facts are. It's a controversial theory, so some people don't think that's what facts are. Some people think facts are something other than that. They're more heavyweight than what I've just described. And I actually think there's a lot of plausibility to the idea that maybe facts are more heavyweight than what I've just described. And so I tend to myself not accept deflationism about facts, though I kind of like it about truth to some extent. But whether or not you accept that grand theory, what you might instead is just a certain methodological suggestion, which is it might be useful for us to go ahead and think about our concerns about moral facts while avoiding talking about facts. The word fact is loaded, and people often mean different things by it. I think Doug did a good job of starting to bring some of this out when he was saying that he wanted to talk about objective moral facts, or things that didn't depend on our social practices, facts that are different than facts like it's rude to do such and such. And so I think that's what you should do. Are you worried about moral facts because facts seem like the kind of things rational people don't disagree about, and you think, but we do disagree about moral facts, so you're worried there aren't any moral facts? That's fine, but I think it's better if you just don't focus on this term facts and focus on the relevance of whether rational people can disagree about something and what this might tell us. Similarly, maybe you're worried about moral facts because you're worried about objectivity. Again, I think don't focus on what facts are or using this term facts. Focus on the relevance of objectivity and what this tells us. Are you worried about moral facts because facts don't depend on attitudes and you're thinking maybe moral facts do? Again, I think better not to focus on this, just focus on the relevance of attitude independence. So to illustrate here, one way to think about this is if you're worried that, it's not a moral fact that murder is wrong because you think you think facts are attitude independent, and you think morality isn't attitude dependent, you can translate this concern by saying that you're worried about whether murder is wrong because you think the wrongness of murder is can't be attitude dependent if it's really wrong, but it is. So you could translate it like that. It can be a little complicated to translate fact talk to non-fact talk in certain examples because of the summarizing feature of fact talk, as I mentioned earlier, but it can be done with some care. All right, so that's suggestion one. Don't worry too much about facts. Worry instead about what you really care about. If you care about rational disagreement, worry about that. Worry about objectivity if you're worried about that. The importance of this suggestion is that it gets us away from being too concerned about this meaning of this sort of obscure term and gets us to say actually what we mean, what we really care about. And I think when we do this, we'll find actually different people care about different things when they're worried about moral facts. And I think we'll be able to make some progress if we do that. And that's all true, even if we think there really is something to facts over and above what the deflationist thinks. You can still go ahead and try to phrase your concern in a way that doesn't depend on talking about facts. Okay, so that's suggestion one. Suggestion two, do worry about how moral stuff is connected to other stuff. Here are some examples that are going to help us get in the mood for thinking about the issue that I would like us to think about. So the first example is actually, I think, the place where this subject started to have an important discussion in the philosophical literature. This is from R.M. Hare in The Language of Morals, which was published in the 1950s or something. And so here's what Hare says. He says, suppose that we say St. Francis was a good man. Hare says it's logically impossible to say this and to maintain at the same time there might have been another man placed exactly in the same circumstances as St. Francis who behaved exactly the same way, but who differed from St. Francis in respect only that he was not a good man. And here's another example. This one's from Trista McPherson. And this is from the SEP, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, Supervenience Claims and Ethics, which would be a good resource to check out if you want to learn more about this topic. McPherson writes, suppose that a bank manager wrongfully embezzles their client's money. If we imagine holding fixed how much the bank manager stole and how the trust their customers placed in them, what they did with the money, all of the short and long-term consequences of their actions, and so on, it seems that there could not be a second action that perfectly resembled this embezzlement, except the second action was right rather than wrong. Okay, I hope you'll agree with those claims. What do they suggest? Well, what they suggest is when something's wrong, good, right, etc., that this is actually tightly connected to non-moral facts about the action. Look back at what Hare and McPherson are saying. They're saying, take St. Francis, who's a good man. Now imagine a different possible person who's in the exact circumstances of St. Francis and does all the stuff St. Francis does. And the thought is that person's also good. So the idea is that by fixing those non-moral facts, you've also fixed the moral fact. Same with McPherson's example. The idea is that there can't be, in a slogan form, that there's no change in how things are morally without a change in how things are non-morally. That's what examples like this suggest. And that's a kind of tight connection between morality, moral stuff, and non-moral stuff. That you can't change the moral stuff without changing the non-moral stuff. These kinds of no A change without a B change claims occur throughout philosophy, and they're called supervenience claims. Other areas once they occur are aesthetics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science. So to give an example from the philosophy of mind, you might think, well, look, you can't have a change in what you believe unless there's some change in the physical constitution of something, like your mind, your brain, for example, or perhaps your larger environment, including your brain. Similarly, in the sciences, you might think all the chemical facts, the facts of chemistry, supervene on the facts of physics. There couldn't be a change in some fact about chemistry or some chemical feature of a situation without there being a change in some physical feature of the situation. So these kinds of supervenience claims are useful, and they suggest tight connections between two distinct domains. The basic idea in our case is something like, it is in the nature of morality that if some act is wrong, it has certain non-moral features, and it has to be that any other act with those non-moral features is also wrong. Notice here there's two occurrences of necessity. I'm talking about something being in the nature of morality and something that has to be. This is called, in the literature, called strong supervenience, and I give a little statement over here. The idea is that for anything at all, if it's wrong to do it, then there's some non-moral ways things can be, such that it has that non-moral feature, and everything that has that non-moral feature, and necessarily everything that has that non-moral feature, is wrong. In fact, we want even something more general, because notice this just talks about wrongness, but what we said is the same is true of goodness and badness, what we ought to do, etc. here. Oh, by the way, I should just pause and say, I'm not being mindful of the important ideas that Peter brought up, that we should think about the difference between moral issues and other normative issues. So I focused on moral issues here. These same points apply to any normative property as well. So an important question to ask when thinking about this is, what do we mean by necessarily here? So we could talk about things having to be and things being necessary in different ways. We might say something's necessary because of due to the laws necessary. The necessity of something is logical, meaning like the logical laws ensure it, or physical, meaning the laws of physics ensure it, things like that. So we want to ask in this claim, what do each of these mean? I won't get into this here, but that's just an important further question to ask. The standard answer has been that the first one has to do with our concepts. That is, in order for you to be able to think about morality, you have to, if you understand what comes after the first one fully, be disposed to accept it. That's what some people think. And the second one has generally been thought to be metaphysical. That is to say, it's about how ways things could be in the most general sense. But that's a bit controversial, but that's an important next question. Okay, so there's this kind of tight connection between moral stuff and non-moral stuff. That's the first point. The second point is, what might explain this? Why is it morality is connected to this other stuff? That there can't be a moral change without a non-moral change. Here's one explanation of that. Suppose you thought what it is to be wrong is to cause pain. That's just what wrongness is. Then it looks like we have an explanation. Why couldn't there be a change in what's wrong without a change in non-moral stuff? Well, what's wrong just is to cause pain, and that's a non-moral feature of things. So it seems like we've explained it. Now, two complications arise here. The first one is what I said earlier. We want to understand not just moral features, but not just the feature of wrongness. We also want to understand all the moral features, so rightness, goodness, badness, things like that. The second complication is there really a difference between moral and non-moral facts, properties, et cetera, on this view? After all, it says what wrongness is causing pain, and I said that's non-moral, but I said that's what wrongness is. So there's some little tricky issues here, little fiddly issues you got to work out to make this work. So those are some issues that if you like this kind of view, you got to think more about. What if there's no explanation? What if we just said, hey, there's nothing to explain here? We offer no explanation of this. We just say it's true and move on. You know, that's the thing that you might try to say. You might accept, but it's not crazy. I don't think it's not incoherent or crazy, but it's a cost. Why is it a cost? Well, it's a cost because generally what we want to see when we're giving a theory is that we can explain any of the phenomena that are not trivial, and it's not trivial that morality has to supervene on the way things are, non-moral features. That's not some obvious claim. It's not super clear why it is, what it is about morality that makes it like that. So it's a kind of thing you'd like an explanation of. The last thing is you might think moral principles itself could explain this. You might think, well, look, here's how I explain it. Well, the fact that I promise to help you move That's what, and you failed to move. That's what explains why it's wrong to fail to help you move. That I promise. So that explains why wrongness, you can't have a change in the wrongness of that act without a non-normative change. I don't think this is going to work. And here's just a snippet of why. This explanation might explain for each type of act why it'd be wrong to do that and how that's connected to a non-normative feature. But explanations like that aren't always satisfying. So for example, I might be able to explain why did everybody come, why did the members of the philosophy club show up to the bar? I might talk about each and every person in the philosophy club and what their beliefs and desires are and use that to explain how they got there. But that doesn't explain why they congregated and why there's unity into this feature, why all of them were philosophy club members and also there. What might explain that is that it's a party for the philosophy club, right? So some unifying explanation that goes across all of the people. And a similar thing is what you would really want to explain supervenience, not just one explanation citing one moral principle for one act, a different one for a different one, and so on. You want some general explanation that's going to do everything. All right. So a general thing is that explaining the connection is one of the aims you have one of the things you should aim for when you're giving a metaethical theory. And if you read about metaethics, lots of different theories try to do this. All right, so that's all. Just to sum up, my idea is how should you think about moral facts? 1, don't worry too much about what facts are. 2, do worry about how moral stuff is connected to other stuff. And that's all.
Thank you so much. If any of the professors have any comments or last minute things that they want to say, feel free to chime in, or else we're going to move on to the Q&A. Okay. Grace and Tim, I'm going to hand it off to you to go through the questions, but if anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll go through them. Or not the chat, the Q&A feature, and we'll go through them.
So just to start out, we had a question about whether or not this is going to be recorded, and the answer is yes, it is recorded. It will be uploaded to the Shippers YouTube page. Sometime after the event, it takes time to encode and everything else for that. So that's answer. I answered that too in the chat, but I just wanted to go ahead and say that out loud. And then we have a question for Professor Portmore. It's talking about how one person argued that we can't look to a consequentialist framework since there are an infinite number of consequences or possibilities, and thus one person cannot evaluate the possibilities and must reject the method since they can get easily anxiety or overwhelmed trying to evaluate all possibilities in the consequentialist framework. And how would you respond to that?
Okay, thanks for that question. So, I mean, that's part of a general sort of criticism about consequentialism, that consequentialism just isn't that feasible as a way of deciding how to live your life and deciding what to do on a day-to-day basis, because as the questioner pointed out, there's an infinite number of possible actions that you could perform, and if time goes on for infinity, then the consequences for each one of those options is going to go on for infinity. Now, the usual response, and I'm partial to this response myself, is to say that we need to distinguish between a criterion of rightness and a decision procedure. So what consequentialism is, it is a criterion of rightness. That is, it tells us what makes an act right. Okay. It doesn't tell us how to go about deciding what to do on a day-to-day basis. To draw an analogy, this is what you should do when buying stocks. You should buy low and sell high. Now, this advice is not very good for day-to-day decision making because it doesn't tell you which stocks are low at this point and which stocks are going to be high, and you never know whether, you know, is the Apple stock at its highest peak now, or is it going to get higher months from now? So it doesn't help you in terms of your day-to-day decision making, in terms of buying and selling stocks. But nevertheless, what makes a stock purchase, a stock trade good is that you bought that stock when it was at its lowest and you sold it when it was at its highest. That's what makes it a good stock trade. likewise, what the consequentialist says, what makes an act the right act or a better act than any of the alternatives is that it produces better consequences than any of the alternatives. Now, since you as an agent can't figure out which act that is, that just means that you shouldn't use consequentialism as a decision procedure.
Thank you. Our next question is from Gabby. She asks, couldn't you argue that calling an action like placing your hand on a hot stove stupid is a judgment versus a perceived fact? Wouldn't the objective fact be that placing your hand on a hot stove is painful, which would make it immoral in accordance with natural law theory?
Thank you for your question, Gabby. So in response to the, so you're making a distinction between a judgment and a perceived fact. And so I just want to comment, I think sometimes, so the topic of this session is moral facts. And I do think that sometimes people use the term moral fact very broadly, just to include any sort of evaluative fact or any fact that isn't, as you say, a perceptual fact, but presumably you might want to include, I don't know, you might want to include facts of arithmetic and geometry and some scientific facts, but there is sort of a sense that there's this domain of evaluation, and that's very different from that. The judgments, evaluative judgments, are a very different kind of judgment. And so that's one thing that people might mean moral, but as I pointed out, that seems much too inclusive. It seems much too broad. So then the second part of your question, let's see, is about, you say, that one's gone now. It's something about natural law. Can you repeat it? I don't see it now. I couldn't quite get it.
Yeah, absolutely. She says, wouldn't the objective fact be that placing your hand on a hot stove is painful, which would make it immoral in accordance with natural law theory?
Well, certainly if it causes you pain, it's an objective fact that it's painful. Whether that would make it wrong would depend on what is, in a sense, is what the correct moral theory, what is right, what the property of wrongness is, and what is it that makes it the case that an action is wrong. And then finally, I mean, it would depend what you meant by natural law theory. So there's a lot going on here, and it's hard to know exactly how to respond to the details of your question. So I'm sorry if I didn't get to the essence of it, but that's the best I can do.
So this is more of an open question. No professor has been listed as the target. Can our ideas or philosophy be true or facts? And how can we tell what is fact or truth? If there is no truth or facts, why do we engage with these ideas if we can never find the truth? Hopefully that made sense, they said.
I can give this a shot if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
And this is just to repeat something I said earlier. I think here's a very useful place where even if we don't accept that to be true, that for it to be true that there's a table is just for there to be a table, or for it to be true that murder is wrong is just for murder to be wrong, what I call deflationism. Even if we don't embrace that, it would be good to see if we can frame our concerns without using the term true or fact, or because it'll often help us be more specific. So one thing you might worry about when you're worried about whether there can be philosophical truths or facts is you might be worried about, so to take an example, suppose you're worried about the question of whether God exists. It's the question philosophers are interested in. I think most people would agree either God exists or God doesn't. We're just trying to figure out which one it is. And so in some sense, if you think it's true that God exists, that the only interesting question there is whether God exists, it's very clear there can be a truth in that sense. But I think what people are worried about is, do we have any method of figuring it out? not just is it somehow out there whether God exists or not, but do we have any good way of figuring out whether God exists? And here I think, there are much more challenging questions. And some of the issues that Doug brought up, I think, should induce a little bit of anxiety actually about this. So one of the things Doug said is that in philosophical inquiry, there's, as it were, there's a sort of diversity which leads to ineliminable disagreement. And I think when you start to see things that way, that our methods are inadequate for us to figure out the answers to our questions or to figure out unanimous answers to our questions, it becomes pressing whether or not we really could ever know the answers to these questions. So that might be one thing we're worried about when we're worried about can our ideas be true or facts. We might be really worried about whether we can know the answers to these questions. Maybe all we can do is formulate some general thoughts and say how they hang together, but we could never know. And that might be disturbing. Maybe it's not disturbing to some, but it might be disturbing. So I think that's a different way of thinking about your question. And for my own part, I think we probably can, because I don't think disagreement fully undermines whether we know things, but I do think it's anxiety inducing. It's a thing to be worried about. It's not obvious we can know the answer to some of the questions we ask when we do philosophy.
Thank you. Our next question is from Noah. He opens this up to whomever would like to answer it. He said, do you think that we have an obligation as the first self-aware species to analyze the moralness of the animal kingdom and strive to do better because we understand the consequences of our actions?
Grace, why don't you assign it to one of us?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to take it, Dr. Portmore?
Darn, I shouldn't have said that, huh? Okay. Do we have an obligation as a first self to analyze the moralness of the animal kingdom? So I think we have a moral obligation to make the world a better place, but I don't know that we have a moral obligation to analyze the moralness of the animal kingdom. So I think, and I don't think that we're the only moral creatures. I mean, from what I've seen about studies of primates, they've shown that primates make moral decisions as well. So there have been experiments where they put a monkey or some kind of primate right next to a machine where you push this lever in order to get food out, and the machine is rigged so that if you push the lever in order to get food out, the primate is electrocuted and is and you can, it's in a glass like chamber, and so the other primates can see that the monkey is being tortured every time they lift up the lever to get food. And then the other primates decide to stop lifting up the lever. So seems like the primates are better than us, at least in this particular case.
Thank you. The next question will be for Professor de Marneffe. It says, I think you went from the idea that morality is a genus with a heterogeneous variety of species, the good, the just, the virtuous, the shameful, etc., to debunking the term moral, that we should do without it unless we stipulate its meaning. The debunking move seems unwarranted. Why not say instead that the moral is the genus of how we ought to live in relation to others, where we have this list of species of moral considerations?
Yeah, so I guess I think that that is, I mean, I guess I would say you've just stipulated a meaning. I don't think that that is what everyone means by the term. But of course, I mean, what I was questioning is whether there's a normative kind that is what, in effect, everyone or most everyone is referring to when they use the term. That I don't think is true. I think that it's possible for anyone to say, this is what I mean by moral. So if you say what I mean by moral is anything that has to do with, how best to live, I think, okay. I don't think that's what everyone means by the term. And I'm not willing to say that people who use it differently are using it incorrectly.
Thank you. Our next question can go to anyone who wants it, but if no one wants it, I'll assign it. How would you respond to arguments made by pragmatists such as Hilary Putnam, who argue that an attempt to separate values from facts is implying that facts themselves are not value judgments on some level? Moreover, how could a theory such as instrumentalism fit into this discussion? Could multiple theories, even if contradictory, be true in different areas depending on their use? And I'll give this one to Dr. Portmore only because I know another question is coming up for a different professor.
Oh no. I don't know how to answer this question. I'm not sure what the person means by instrumentalism. Could multiple theories, even if contradictory, be true in different areas depending on their use? Well, if they're contradictory, then I would say no, they can't be true. I'm sorry. I don't have anything interesting to say.
Maybe I can say something. So I'm not sure if this is what, sorry, I don't know who asked the question. I don't know if this is what Grant had in mind with instrumentalism, but from the context, I was thinking maybe what Grant meant was instrumentalism is the idea that whether you ought to accept a theory depends on its usefulness in the context of answering certain types of questions. That would seem to suggest that perhaps even if contradictory theories can't both be true, it could be that you ought to accept theory A for the purpose of answering certain questions, and you ought to accept theory B for answering certain other questions, and A and B are contradictory. So now, how does instrumentalism fit with the discussion? I think it's hard to know, really. I mean, one complexity here that's different than the philosophy of science case is in the philosophy of science case, the subject matter isn't a subject matter about what's useful, right? The subject matter is a subject matter about, what there is or how to build a bridge or something like that. Whereas in the moral case, it's a little complicated because part of the thing you're answering is like what is what bears on the instrumental choice itself. So there's a complexity like that. But I do think some people have had your perspective about morality. It's sort of a perspective on which you should think of morality as sort of a design challenge. You think, what sort of system of rules would be the right kind to help us solve a coordination problem? And then we call those the moral rules. And then you might think there's a different question you might ask. What sort of system of rules would be the right one for us to make the world a better place? That might have a different answer. And what sort of system of rules would be the right one to govern our attitudes of resentment toward one another? And that might be a different one. I think it's wide open that might be a theory that's true of morality, or that might be the right way to approach moral questions, I think. And so I think insofar as that's what you have in mind, I think that's definitely a live option among the options that are available. You might think there's connection between these questions, and so you have to control for that a bit, I think. But yeah, and the Putnam thing, I can't quite speak to that, unfortunately.
Thank you. Professor Nair, we actually had another question directed to you. Thank you for your interesting presentation, Eric says. If moral facts supervene on non-moral facts, and some non-moral facts supervene on microphysical facts, would at least some moral facts supervene on the microphysical facts? If so, can morality be reduced to facts about the microphysical world?
Okay, great. Yeah, Eric, that's a great question. So So in general, so supervenience, that relation is one that's been studied. And in general, it does have a logical feature which you're relying on, which is a kind of transitivity feature, that if A supervenes on B and B supervenes on C, then A supervenes on C. There's some complexity here because you talk about some non-moral facts, but let's put that aside. Suppose all non-moral facts supervene on the microphysical facts, then I think it'll probably be right. And you ask then, so does that mean morality can be reduced to facts about the microphysical world? And here I think we need to be a little careful when we think about this. So supervenience doesn't say one domain is identical to or reducible to another. They just says they're connected to one another, right? They may or may not be reducible to one another. They might be distinct. And there's an interesting question of whether or not they're distinct or reducible, or what the relation is between the two domains. And how do we decide this question? Well, one thing I suggested was if you do accept reduction, you could explain the supervenience thing. So that's a good making feature of it. But there might be other considerations that make it so you don't want to accept it. So one very famous one in philosophy, especially in thinking of philosophy mind, is the so-called issue of multiple realizability. So the idea might be, look, maybe in order to change what you believe, you have to have some physical changes. So the mental supervenes on the physical. But people have thought, but maybe mentality is multiply realizable. That is, there are lots of different physical states, which could be a belief state, very different from one another. So if that's right, and so they might be very, very different. So then one might be a brain state, and one might be, say, a state of a certain piece of software, right? Maybe you think certain computer programs can instantiate belief. Or it might be just very different kinds of brain states, right? There's not like some one simple brain state, which is believing that the table is a square, right? I mean, there's lots of different brain states different people can have. And if you notice that, there's just this heterogeneous array of physical facts that all could be different ways in which something could be a belief. You might conclude from that the beliefs aren't reducible to just some crazy disjunction of these facts because they're so different. They're still somehow their own special thing that play their own role. And they enable certain sorts of, and they earn their keep, beliefs as separate from the disjunction of the physical things because they play a special role in our ability to explain people's behavior. And you might think the exact same thing about morality. You might think, yeah, if we tried to break it down to the microphysical level, it wouldn't be right to say morality is reducible because like the electron firing patterns would be just so heterogeneous, there'd be no unity to them. And moral facts would earn their keep as a separate set of facts because it could, say, explain our practices of praise and blame, etc. Something like that. So it's a great question. But yeah, I think even if supervenience holds, it's still a further question whether they're reducible.
Thank you so much. Our next question is going to go to Professor Marneffe, and it's from Timothy. And he asks, can moral questions be answered outside of philosophy or religion? Can science answer our moral questions?
So thanks for the question, Timothy. So just let me ask you, can you, when you use the term our moral questions, what are you thinking of, or what's the first thing that pops into your mind? That is, what is the first thing that pops in your mind? Is it like the clearest example of a moral question? Do we don't get responses, I guess? It's just one way. Oh, hey,
I think it's just one way. It's different. It's a different Tim.
That out. I just figured that out. So it's tricky because, so suppose, so I guess I would say yes, on certain theories, depending on what you understand morality to be, on certain theories, science could answer all our moral questions. So one of the main families of moral theory is known as utilitarianism. And this was sort of first stated in its classic form by Jeremy Bentham. And according to utilitarianism, we should always act so as to maximize net pleasure, the total amount of pleasure minus the total amount of pain. And I'm inclined to think that if that's right, then in principle, every moral question could be answered scientifically. We'd have to be able to measure how much pain an action caused, how much pleasure. I mean, it would be tricky, but maybe if determinism is true, who knows? But I mean, in principle, every moral question could be answered scientifically. So what you think the relationship is between morality and science is going to depend on what property you think it is that makes, say, an action wrong, and whether that's the kind of property that could be successfully investigated by science, and whether science could make reliable predictions about it.
Thank you so much. So our next question comes from Louise, I want to say Pyers, but I'm probably pronouncing that horribly. It says, moral philosophers like Sam Harris have proposed a move toward an objective morality that is rooted in consequentialist theory. They attribute religion to the unnecessary suffering of human beings. While it seems true that many moral principles outlined in Scripture are insufficient and incompatible with human well-being, slavery, sexual repression, and so on, do you believe that humans have the reasoning capacity to make moral judgment absent of Scripture? And Professor Portmore, I believe you were talking about consequentialists earlier.
Yeah, so I'll take this one. So I certainly do think that humans have the reasoning capacity to make moral judgments absent Scripture. In fact, I think we have to do that. I mean, this goes back to Plato's Euthyphro dilemma, right? So is an act wrong because God forbids it, or does God forbid it because it's wrong? It seems very counterintuitive to think that an act is wrong because God forbids it. This would make what's right and wrong arbitrary in a way. There would be no reason for God to, say, forbid cruelty rather than compassion, except that, I mean, you might say, well, but cruelty would bring about bad consequences. But assuming that God can determine what's right and wrong, then you would think that God would determine what's good and bad. So it wouldn't be bad for people to be cruel to each other and cause a lot of suffering. Suffering would be good if that's what God wanted us to do. And then God seems like a tyrant, right? Why, if God decides what's right and wrong, then God could just say, you can do whatever you want and everybody can go to heaven. Why then is he imposing constraints on us? Why is he forbidding us from committing adultery and committing murder if he could, in theory, say that everything is okay? It seems like he's just exercising his power over us without any moral justification, in which case he would seem to be tyrannical. So I think it's much more plausible to take the other horn of the Euthyphro dilemma and think that that God forbids it because it's wrong. So he's like a good parent who is able to figure out what's right and wrong, given that he's all-knowing. And just as I tell my daughter not to do wrong things, God tells us not to do wrong things. But in that case, then it's not that God that determines what's right and wrong, it's something else, and it's up to us to figure out what that something else is and to interpret Scripture accordingly. So for instance, if you believe in the 10 Commandments, it says thou shalt not kill. But nobody interprets that to mean you can't use Listerine, even though that kills germs dead. So I think we're going to have to use our rationality to interpret what's right and wrong. Thanks for the question, Louise.
Thank you. Our next question I'm going to give to Professor Nair, and this attendee says, as I've experienced this issue regarding moral facts, a lot of the arguments that attempt to prove that moral facts exist rely on the premise of accepting idealism. However, for someone who is a physicalist and does not believe objective reality is defined by our concepts about things rather than the physical manifestations of them, are there any arguments for moral facts' existence under the premise of physicalism?
Professor
You're
Nair, I
muted,
believe
Shyam.
Yeah. I believe you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think I'm unmuted now. So that's an interesting question. So sometimes what people mean by physicalism is the thesis that all there is are the kinds of things that are the subject matter of the true physical theory. So, so in other words, all there is the things entailed by the truth of the true physical theory. So that might be, electrons or quarks and things like that, and that everything else doesn't exist. So that might be what physicalism says. I think if that's right, it's not altogether obvious whether there are moral facts. And again, as I say, the way you should translate that is just translate that into a first order question about, so the question is, if all there is facts about the locations of particles, is it the case that murder is wrong? And maybe it's not the case if that's all if you mean there's literally nothing else. And that would not be the case if you thought that the fact whether murder is wrong can't be identified with simply a distribution of particles. If you thought it could be identified with a certain kind of distribution of particles, say the ones that involve the murdering of somebody and certain sort of attitudes and things like that, if you thought that's what wrongness consisted in, say pain, and you thought you could identify pain with a distribution of physical particles, then you could allow for the existence of moral facts compatible with physicalism. Now, another thing people might mean by when you make the contrast with idealism, another thing you might have meant is idealists sort of think of certain things that we normally think of as external objects as really our ideas or God's ideas or something like that. I think certainly murder being wrong is very much compatible with it being the case that all of this stuff like stealing being wrong, murder being wrong aren't just features of our ideas or our own ideas. For example, again, you could have a simple theory according to which what wrongness is pain, and then causing pain. And according to that, murder being wrong doesn't depend on our ideas. It doesn't depend on pain, whether we're in pain, but that's not one of our ideas. So it doesn't depend, for example, on us believing it's wrong. It just depends on whether it causes pain. So that would be another thing. And in fact, many people, I think both Professor Portmore and Professor Marneffe think that, in fact, what's morally wrong doesn't depend on our ideas and isn't anything physical. So that's a further sort of non-idealist view of wrongness. They think of it like, I guess, sort of like wrongness as being something abstract, like mathematical truths. So that kind of view is a view on which you can have things being wrong while not embracing idealism. Now, none of this is, you ask for, can you prove there are moral facts compatible with physicalism? Well, the answer to that, I think, is probably no. I probably don't think you can prove, or if you can, it's sort of a fiddly kind of proof that there are moral facts compatible with basically any doctrine, but it's compatible that there are moral facts with this view, even if you perhaps can't prove it in a way you might do a mathematical proof or something.
Thank you so much. Just want to thank everyone for answering the questions. I'm going to turn it over to Isabella now.
Thanks, Tim. So we're going to finish up the event. I just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you to the professors for being part of our panel. Thank you, Rachel and Shippers, for allowing us to have such a successful event. It was amazing. Great turnout. We will see you all next time. Don't forget to check the Sun Devil Sync for future events and join our meeting on February 3rd. Have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Grace.
Thank you.
Thank you all, professors. Thank you.